What's up, future shredlords? Welcome back. Death to the Fingers. Got a bit of a doozy going on today. So essentially, we're into dominant 7 territory. We're going to go through each step of this idea. I do it slowly, of course, and I give other examples where it's more practical to do in a more isolated context, if you will, right? Where it's not just the one big lick. You can just isolate this small part of the lick and practice that. And you should, obviously. So we got a whole wizard's bag going on here. The bag of holding. I got some 3-in-1 nastiness in there. That's pretty killer. And of course, we go through that really grueling arpeggio sequence with respect to dominant 7. Now listen, with respect to triads, that's more about breaking down the fretboard, right? The Ionian position, the Dorian position, Phrygian. Oh, I can do major, minor arpeggios here. I can play this scale. I can play this chord kind of situation. But with dominant 7, you're starting to get into the blending of sounds. You're looking for sympathetic sounds, basically, you know, complementary pairs. And later on, of course, longer sequences where it could be 3 or 4 or 5, whatever, without it turning into a run-on sentence type deal. But that becomes a skill in and of itself, right? These chains where you're starting to chain these sounds together. So one sets up the next and then sort of takes the pressure off, and then you crank it up again, and you sort of have these peaks and valleys. As far as the improv is concerned, it's very, very useful. And of course, this is Arpeggio Country 101. This is like what they were designed to do in a lot of ways. So it's a really super useful tool. So again, think of this whole sort of lesson as a template, if you will, to apply to your own level of understanding and learning. And of course, use it also as a teaching mechanic, if you will, to be like, I need to get better in this area right here. My understanding over here is not so great. And once you start thinking about that, you can target it like a laser and then just go in there and correct it. It takes like a month. And then you can quickly start to focus on something else because you've corrected that bad habit. Most of the problems that are plaguing your playing are up here in your mind. You're not concentrating. You're not able to obviously sort of move from one idea to the next fluidly. So obviously an exercise like this with the arpeggios forces you to basically be like, okay, it's this position, and really break it down in a surgical manner. And so you can see the higher order purpose of this exercise is not to be like, oh, look at how many arpeggios I can string together. It's speed of mind, connecting them together in a way that sounds cool and utilitarian based around the backing track, but also has all of the hallmark sort of necessities of music, the synergy, right? The both complementary in terms of technique, using 3-in-1 and the arpeggios, but also in terms of the sounds. So once you start thinking like that, obviously, and building up the catalog in your mind, like a flashcard to be like, okay, I'm in the Ionian position. I can do this 3-in-1 technique here if I want to. Boom, you start to apply it to the Ionian positions, 3 notes per string. And of course, it's going to be a bit of an overlap with Locrian. But you'll see me do that, lay out these positions so that I see these 3 positions as one big chunk on the fretboard. And then I can just play 3 notes on one string and then 1 note on the next string and then 3. And there it is. The arpeggios for themselves, they speak for themselves, right? That's no big deal. The only sort of magic trick I'm doing there is essentially connecting them together using 3 notes per string on the high E string or the low E string. So that's a great way of sort of smoothing out the transitions and adding an extra little bit of flavor. Okay, it costs nothing more, really. And of course, getting the extra practice value in there of actually now doing alternate picking, essentially on the high E or low E string to sort of move around. And of course, later on, start to insert melodies, not just use it as a very quick vehicle, instead prolong it into something more meaningful, and then, of course, move into the next arpeggio. So it could be used as a vehicle to get even further or back down the fretboard to set up an even cooler arpeggio. So there's that. So here we go. Dominant 7 stuff. Let's get into part 1. All right, part one obviously is just setting the table. You saw me do a bunch of G major stuff, essentially play it vertically at the 3rd fret and then build it out horizontally on just the low E string. You saw me do the G major pentatonic scale, which is obviously deeply tied with the G major scale played as the classical method. You saw the G major chord played as an E-type from the Cage system. You saw me do the G major triad arpeggio starting from the 3rd fret. So you have all this basic information there, right? And of course, last but not least, you see me lay out the 3 positions essentially necessary for me to do the 3-in-1 technique, which would be Aeolian, then you're into Locrian, and finally Ionian, right? So I need to see all 3 of those positions simultaneously so I can just choose a section to play vertically up and down, since those scale systems effectively move on an angle if you're doing 3 notes per string, which at first you're like, well, that shouldn't be a big deal. That's what I thought too, but you actually have to sit there and be like, okay, that's actually pretty weird. And of course, what happens is you get some pretty nasty jumps, which we'll get into in the next section. But step number 1 has to be to just sort of set the table and get the sound in your ear, if you will, of the natural environment, what you're going to be working with, because everything else is going to be based around this. So if you do not understand this, then you can have no point of reference to actually understand the parts to come after. That's why it's so important to be able to be like, we're playing in this key, whether it's major or minor. And if it is a minor key, you can be like, that is by de facto this major key also, and vice versa. If you're playing in a major key, you can be like, its relative minor is this one. So you see what I mean? There it is. Right, let's get into the next section. All right, the opening salvo obviously is a 3-in-1 sort of sequence where I start in Locrian and I move to the Ionian position, and I use 3 notes per string. So you have to see multiple sort of modal positions overlaid on the fretboard at the same time, because effectively I'm ganging up the Locrian position with Aeolian, and then I'm doing the upper half of Locrian into Ionian, right? So I have to see these 2 sort of 3 notes per string systems sort of side by side so I can just carve out this one little vertical region. And there I'm going to use the 3-in-1 technique. And that is essentially so I can play fast. It's just really another way of playing the notes on the guitar and whatnot can offer a really, really cool flavor with respect to improvisation. So you're going to do like this idea where you're going to play down, up, and then it goes down, 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 up, down, 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 up, down, 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 up. Of course, classic Frank Gambale idea. It does facilitate speed, but of course, the more important thing is just the coolness of the note selection. When I do it, I get like this offset in the actual grouping of notes. So the groups of 3 end up on the low E string, then the D string, and then the B string. But when I come down in the Ionian position, it end up on the high E string, then on the G string, and then on the A string, right? So there's this really great symmetry that goes on there. So this is an essential technique. Run through it, be musical, just be patient with it. And of course, it's another way of just seeing how to play, if you will, the 3 notes per string system. Think of it that way, as 3 notes per string, but harder, if you want to call it that. So, you know, start slow by position and then just try to see the 2 together. And either way, that's going to be a good thing, because you'll be like, oh, look, these 2 positions, they basically layer over top of each other. That can actually open some other doors for you later on. All right, let's get into the next section. All right, here we are at the arpeggio sequence. The first one, obviously, arpeggio sequence A, where it's just your straight up arpeggios. Now, obviously, this is about synergy. It's about marrying up the sounds with D7 in the Locrian position, and I move up to the D7 in the create tension. So I jump up to Lydian and I play minor 7 flat 5. The Lydian position, I'm like, I need to release. So I jump down to Phrygian and I play the minor 7. Like I need to release the tension one more time to get back to a position of rest so I can get to a pivot place or a pivot position and start my next arpeggio sequence. So I'm like, might as well come down with just this G major scale fragment. That right there is obviously, most people don't actually understand the sort of their thinking skills. I'm like, start off with dominant 7, so it starts funky and fresh. It's people are like, oh, that's interesting. By doing it twice in 2 different positions. Then from there, I'm like, I need to create tension so I can keep my idea going. I need to do something to what I'm doing right now to it's minor 7 flat 5. And people are like, oh, that's pretty spicy. To do is release the tension. So I do that using a minor 7. Instead of using major 7, in this case, I use minor 7. Minor 7, I'm like, I can, one more time, by moving down to a scale fragment, essentially using the major scale. So there is planning there. It's random. Got to think too, to be like, okay, I'm going to do 2 dominant 7s to or 7 with some sort of 3 notes per string scale system. You can be like, do the melodic minor, the harmonic minor, or it's the some sort of blues scale. Bebop scale is another good choice. Let's get into the next section. All right, when I did the first sequence of arpeggios, that's essentially the call, right? So now I need to come up with the answer, just thinking in terms of, you know, the global music ideas. So effectively, I want to do another 4 arpeggios, but if I do 4 more basic arpeggios, it's going to sound pretty boring and samey, right? So I need to find some sort of chameleon-like technique that would lend itself well to mixing and matching with these dominant 7 arpeggios, and of course it's 3 and 1. Shocker, right? So when you're practicing these dominant 7 arpeggios, when you're not doing sort of the inversion sequences and connecting them together in the kind of sequence you see me do in the next section, you should be mixing and matching them with 3 and 1, both as the pentatonic system of 3 and 1 and as the major modes 3 and 1. And if you want to get into the more exotic stuff, knock yourself out, right? But those ones for sure. So I start off again in Locrian. So I'm like, essentially dominant 7, minor 7 flat 5 are definitely out of the question. Too samey to what I just did. So it'll sort of break the forward momentum of the idea. If I go major 7, I'm also pooched, right? Because I'm like, it'll just bring my idea to an end and kill any forward momentum. So I need to use superimposition. So I borrow from the Phrygian position. I play this minor 7 here, Dunsky. That lets me jump up to the Ionian position where I do 3 and 1. Might as well recycle that technique. But of course, give me the exposure to these two sounds being played together. The arpeggio now to 3-in-1 rather than 3-in-1 to 3-in-1, right? So now you get the mixing and matching happening. That allows me to jump up to the Dorian position. Of course, I'm going to do D7 there, which of course sets me up to do the perfect cadence 5-1 by moving up to Phrygian and then playing G major 7 in the Phrygian position, which allows me to then sneak back down and set up the big sort of end flurry with the G major 7 in groups of 3. So that explains the entirety of the middle section with the two arpeggios. You start off with the call, one grouping. In this case, it made sense just to do your standard sort of like arpeggio sequence. But then when I got to the second one, I'm like, I have to change it up subtly. So by adding in 3-in-1, if you will. Again, people are like, well, you did 3-in-1 already, but that's the intro, right? There's the intro part where I do 3-in-1. And then, of course, you get this subtle shift when I move into the arpeggios. And then, of course, there's a little break when I do, again, another section of arpeggios. And that's the whole point of the whole intro to the call to the answer. And then, of course, the end, which is the section we're going to look at next. So as far as the arpeggios are concerned, of course, superimposition is a big one. And pairing that up, of course, with the 3-in-1 is another sort of no-brainer. And, of course, cadences moving from the 5 chord to the 1. Again, not just mindlessly sort of like playing these things where you're like, well, I thought it might sound cool together. That'll come later on. Initially try to be like, well, listen, this is a 5 chord, so move to the 1 chord, right? That's the most obvious thing you could actually do. And when you start to do things like that, I guarantee you your music skill goes up by a factor of 100. Because now it's deliberate and you're actually expecting it, and now you can recognize it. And of course, when you're hearing the music, you're like expecting it, and then you start to play it. The first part is recognizing it. That's why it's so important. Right, let's get into the final section. All right, with all the arpeggios previous, essentially we're ascending and descending, creating these loops. So it gets very samey sounding. That's not so good. So at the end here, I thought it made sense to basically create an arpeggio sequence that just transverses through all the various positions of the modes while maintaining the structure of the arpeggio. So in this case, it's all G major 7, right? And then the training platform here is just to start to break down that information as to what it is exactly that you're doing, right? When I start off in the Ionian position, that's the first two notes there from the root inversion, either triad or from the major 7, right? G major 7 in this case. When I move up to the Dorian position and I do the sort of symmetrical major thirds stacked on top of each other, well, that's basically the Mixolydian position normally, or the second inversion. That allows me to then slide up. And I'm like, okay, well, I recognize this grouping of 3 notes here, this triad. So that's the A-type chord. So I just use the gauge system to allow me to convert that into the major 7. And then I just did, again, this idea of doing the major 7 by intervals on one string, allowing me to climb up on the high E string before ending with the major scale, climbing down using 3 notes per string. Now, obviously, I just do 2 strings worth in the example, but in the one you just saw, I do the whole scale and stuff like that. So just to make it perfectly clear that you're always sort of thinking about this small section of this much bigger piece of information, because it's easier to keep track of just, zooming in on something like that than it is just this little tiny little piece of information. Let's put it that way. It's like having a filing cabinet that's got 6 million pieces of paper in it rather than just a couple folders worth, right? So pick your poison. So that's just it. It's not about the arpeggios, although this exercise defeats tunnel vision with respect to going up and down in the one particular type, which is going to become very popular with you because you're like, man, it sounds so good when you do these complementary arpeggio systems. But it also sort of forces you to start to think about what it is that you're doing. You're like, this Dorian position here is exactly the same as Mixolydian. And then you'll be like, there's a relationship there. What does that mean, that the stuff from Lydian is going to be true about when I move down to the Ionian position? You see what I mean? And then all of a sudden you've made this very deep and fundamental connection about something that's usually very obvious if you were like, oh, look, there it is. But when you're playing guitar, you don't actually make the connection because you're too busy thinking about 6 million other things. But once you do that, well, then all of a sudden you're like, look, I can take this entire system and just move it over here. So when you are practicing, you're not just like, I'm going to start all from the 6th string now. Then be like, I'm going to start from the A string next. A small change like that in your practice session can be some of the most earth-shattering sort of changes to, improvements in your overall playing in general. It's like the tunnel vision thing. You have to come up with another exercise, if you will, to defeat this thing. This thing here is great. It's awesome. It's amazing. It's beyond amazing. But it also has this one deadly pitfall. And you have to recognize it and be like, do this other thing to defeat that. And in doing that, that opens up another door, and you're like, okay, well, as soon as I did this little sequence here and I start doing it here, okay, well, now all of a sudden this two pieces of information are connected. And now all of a sudden you've made a very, very fundamental revelation about the guitar and music in general. Is this, a lot of this stuff is recycled. And you'd be like, oh, look, I can do it one more time over here. On the D string, right? And if you're far enough up on the fretboard, you can keep going backwards until you get all the strings. Right now, listen, you don't really need to take it to that extreme, but I think you get the point. Is that when you start to actually ask questions, it's not just about, oh, look, this is going to break up tunnel vision. Instead, be like, okay, well, what am I doing here? Once you start doing that, I promise you, your entire playing trajectory will change fundamentally, because you'll be like, okay, look, there's the first two from the root position. Oh, this is from the second inversion. This is from the A type chord. This is from essentially the second inversion. This is the third inversion here. This is the root inversion here. Next one up here, that's the Ionian mode, 3 notes per string. No guitar, no fretboard, no pick, no nothing. Just directly from my mind. That's what you need to work on too. There it is. I think that's the end of the video. I've exhausted the rest of the material. All right, so try to really concentrate on not necessarily copying or accomplishing the exact lick in this video. Instead, adapt over the concepts about chaining arpeggio sequences together to arranging your solos. So there's an intro, there's a call, there's an answer, and there's an outro. Things like that. And I think you'll be very, very surprised that you learned something deep about actually playing the instrument that had nothing to do with the arpeggios themselves. Think about what it is that you're doing. Synergy, combining two elements together, both from a technical perspective and from a sound perspective, and start to marry these elements up. And you'd be like, my playing just got a million times more interesting. And then all of a sudden you'll be that much more motivated to actually play the instrument, and you'll just get that much better at music in general. Great. Thanks for hanging out with me. I appreciate every single one of you. I wish you all the best in your practice sessions. We'll see you in the next one.